Morning, everybody. Welcome to what could be our last Monday of the NTI process. Fix my hair as I'm talking to you today, but nonetheless, this should be. I'll have an idea for you all if this week is the last week of NTI or next week is. Okay, so bear with me. I also think we're going to have an answer this week about as far as entering grades is concerned. If I don't have it done by the last day, do not freak out. Okay, I'd say probably give me about 2 or 3 days after the last day of school to have it done. If you don't have anything if nothing's in the grade book by that point, feel free to email me or give me a call. All right. Let's go ahead and get into today's lesson. That's over civil rights. All right. You should be looking at a document right now that's got Martin Luther King waving to the crowd at what I'm guessing is the "I Have a Dream" speech. I think I see the Washington Monument in the foreground there, or the background there. So let's go ahead and jump into the civil rights movement, all right? Which presidential candidate of the 60s showed the greatest support for Martin Luther King Jr.? This would have been also on Friday's assignment, and that was John F. Kennedy. If you'll remember, I told you Kennedy called Martin Luther King in the Birmingham jail in 1959 and basically offered his support towards Dr. King. And that moved Dr. King so much that, the majority of African Americans who at that point in time still, for the most part, voted Republican, began voting Democrat. And today, here 60 years later, that's still the case where you see an overwhelming majority of African Americans or minorities as a whole voting Democrat, and this is where all that started. One thing I want to point out about the civil rights movement, I like when I hear teachers or people say when the civil rights movement was going on, it's still going on. It never ends. It's kind of like the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't have set dates. It's still going on, right? So in this case, the civil rights movement is still going on today. There's always improvements that can be made. And now you've got, were there more times where it might have been a little bit more violent and might have been in the news more? Sure. Back in the late 50s, throughout the 1960s, all the rioting, you all have seen, and throughout your schooling, you've seen, the fire hoses down in Birmingham, you've seen the freedom rides, the lunch counter sit-ins, the Birmingham church bombing, all those things. Martin Luther King speeches, Malcolm X speeches, Muhammad Ali. Hey, how about that today? You've seen all of those, but the civil rights movement still goes on today. It's an ongoing thing. So, all right, look up King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Identify 3 examples of King looking out for future generations of people. Hopefully that link works on the sheet. If not, it's should be in our Google Classroom page. If not, I'll have it added by the time we're done today. I have a dream. So pick out 3 words that show King is looking out for the future. All right, how do people try to scare Dr. King? Identify and list 2 examples. Well, bombing his house for one. Death threats. King had a very, very, I want to say a dark sense of humor. He knew that people were gunning for him. He knew that people wanted him dead. And Martin Luther King would, at different speaking events, he would joke around with other civil rights leaders about what they were going to say about each other at each other's funerals, right? King knew that there was a chance he was not going to survive or live to see what he preached. He knew there was a chance of that. And so he would kind of make fun of it. He would tell other people that he knew, hey, make sure you say this about me at my funeral. And which is kind of morbid. I kind of identify with that sense of humor a little bit sometimes. But King was, based on all the ways people were trying to scare him, he knew there was a chance somebody would eventually get to him. So King, his house was, he had burning crosses left in his yard. There were bomb threats, death threats. I'm sure his children and his wife were threatened. And one thing I need you, let's go jump in on that note. Let's go jump into number 4. Pretend one of your parents was doing something similar to Dr. King. Why or why not would you want them doing all this protesting? How do you feel about your parents putting their lives on the line? Is that something you support, or is that something you or is that something you say, let that be somebody else's fight? You have a family. It's all your opinion. This is part of the sacrifice. This is why these people, in my opinion, need to be honored and recognized for their commitments towards a cause. They're putting their lives on the line. Dr. King was putting his life on the line. There's no other way to look at it. You know, politicians, as much as we don't like them, in some ways they do put their lives on the line as well. Especially if there's something that they believe in that they know could get them in trouble. So, just something to think about there. In what city was Dr. King arrested and wrote a letter from the jail? That would be Birmingham, Alabama. There's not much in Birmingham, but as a history nerd, I would think that Birmingham would have some desirable locations for a guy like me, or if you're interested in that stuff, to go to see where Dr. King was arrested, where the protesting was, where the fire hoses were sprayed on people. Those would be interesting to see, in my opinion. Also, you'll want to check out Memphis at some point. You can go to the exact spot where Dr. King was assassinated. It is, it sounds mean or crazy to say it's cool, but as a history nerd, you do look at it with some fascination. It's also pretty somber spot. I highly recommend you go check it out. Memphis and Birmingham. What is counterculture? Counterculture is where you're going against what's you can look at it a lot of different ways. Counterculture is where you're going against what society's expectations are of you. That might be the best answer. You're going against maybe what you think society's expectations are of you. In your house, if your parents are, let's say your parents go to church every Sunday, maybe you don't believe in organized religion. Counterculture would be, I'm not going to church. You know, so I use tattoos as an example. I almost think when you guys are older, I almost think your kids are going to show counterculture by not getting a tattoo, because everybody's got a tattoo now, whether they need them or not. I can remember when I was growing up, a tattoo meant that you were tough. If you had some kind of barbed wire tattoo, or you remember your great grandparents would know of the old the old dudes from the military that just had some kind of weird ink blotch on their arm, but that was somehow a tattoo. That was, don't mess with those guys, by the way. I would not. But that, to me, that's counterculture, right? When you're going up against what you think everybody is expecting of you. All of us have some example of participating in a counterculture. The civil rights movement was a part of a counterculture. Malcolm X was a part of which, we're going to jump to Malcolm X. He was a part of which religious group? He was part of the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam. What was Malcolm X's most famous speech? He was a little bit more, Malcolm X was probably a lot more militant than Dr. King. If you're comparing the two, a great analogy to them would be Professor Charles Xavier and Magneto from the X-Men series. It's been said that the X-Men were a play off of the civil rights movement back in the 60s, and that Charles Xavier would be Martin Luther King, Magneto would be Malcolm X, because Xavier wanted mutants and humans to coexist, right? Whereas Magneto wanted mutant superiority. Well, here during the civil rights, I shouldn't have caught myself. In the 60s, in the 60s portion of the civil rights movement, you had Dr. King, who wanted everybody just to be treated equally. Everybody, no matter what. Why can't we be treated equally? Whereas Malcolm X wanted black superiority, right? Reparations. He was very, very militant, a lot more further to the left than maybe Dr. King was. How did Malcolm X die? Well, how else did anybody else die in the 60s? He got shot. So, number 10, the last one, you should be looking at a picture of Cassius Clay, a.k.a. Muhammad Ali. Number 10, the greatest example of counterculture during the civil rights movement are all of the following, except which of these does not fit? Which of these does not fit? You had the Freedom Rides, where people would get on the buses, sit in the front, and right around Alabama. Again, you've heard me say this before. America has some crazy protests. America is built on weird, crazy protests. We literally had people dressing up as Indians and dumping tea into the Boston Harbor. And that was their way of protesting the British during the, leading up to the Revolutionary War. Here during in the 50s and 60s, you had African Americans that would get on buses and they call them freedom rides, and they would ride them around the South, and they were basically, number one, they would sit up front, but they would also basically be daring other people to bomb those buses. It did happen. They'd be daring people to run them off the road. I don't know if that happened or not, but it was their way of showing that, hey, we belong. It was symbolic, I guess. Muhammad Ali refusing to participate in the Vietnam War. His most famous quote was, "I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong." That's another discussion I wish we had more time to get into. But as it is, stupid quarantine. And then the lunch counter sit-ins. People would go, if you may want to ask your grandparents about this, or even your parents might even remember. Back in the day, department stores used to have lunch counters. JCPenney, I know Kmart, you probably remember Kmart, and there in Fairdale used to have a snack bar and everything. But a lot of places, a lot of these department stores like Sears, JCPenney, I'm going to go way back here, and I don't even remember this. I don't even think I was alive for this place, but Woolworths, maybe way back. They would have lunch counters, but at that time, they were segregated. Blacks weren't allowed to come and sit at these lunch counters, and in the 1960s, you see younger college students, maybe kids your all's age, going and sitting at these lunch counters and basically daring other people to react, and people did react. People poured ice water on the protesters. People squirted ketchup and mustard on the protesters, poured hot coffee on them. Not a pleasant scene, but they did it anyway because they wanted to prove a point that they deserved to sit at those lunch counters just as much as any white person did, and they do. So, all right, so the answer on number 10 is going to be B, the police officers beating protests. That's not an example of counterculture. Probably not my greatest question here, but I also thought it'd be the easiest for you guys to answer. So, and that's it for civil rights today. Tomorrow we're going to get into Dr. King's assassination. Again, not cool, but there is some fascinating discussion that goes along with that. So, all right, guys, enjoy this rainy Monday. I'm going to go ahead and get this uploaded, and I'll be available for questions all day. See ya.